The noise came out of nowhere, sharp and startling, yanking me out of my thoughts. A porcelain plate crashed onto the kitchen floor, and the sound of it sent a wave of unease through the room. My dad was at the counter, his back to me, holding his phone with one hand while the other rested on the edge of the sink. His shoulders were stiff, taut with tension. His head hung slightly, as though some invisible weight had suddenly settled on him. "You don't understand," he muttered into the phone, his voice low, urgent. "If this gets out, I'll ruin everything." I froze in the doorway, my breath caught somewhere between curiosity and concern. My dad, who always seemed in control, so confident, sounded afraid. It was a tone I'd never heard from him before. His grip on the phone tightened as whoever was on the other end spoke in a voice too faint for me to catch. He nodded sharply, then ended the call with a quick, final gesture. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of the plate shattering. Slowly, he turned to face me. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed a deep, unspoken worry he was trying to hide. "Morning," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I didn't hear you come in." I nodded toward the broken plate. "You okay?" That sounded intense. He dismissed it with a wave, bending down to clean up the shards. "Just a work thing. Nothing to worry about." His tone was light, almost too casual, but I knew there was more beneath the surface. "Are you sure?" I pressed, stepping closer. Everything's fine," he cut me off, his voice a little sharper. But then, realizing his tone had been too harsh, he softened. "Really, it's nothing. How about breakfast?" I wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Instead, I nodded, deciding to let it go for now. Later that morning, the tension still hung in the air like an unwelcome visitor. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows, but the warmth of it felt out of place against the weight of the silence. Dad kept glancing at his phone, his fingers drumming restlessly on the table. I needed to break the quiet. "So, what's the plan for today?" I asked. He looked up, startled, as though he'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, nothing special," he said. "I thought we could hang out, watch a movie, or something." It was odd. My dad and I were close, sure, but this sudden eagerness to spend time together felt off. I couldn't quite pinpoint why, but the unease from earlier hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "That sounds good." By the time afternoon came around, I'd almost convinced myself that I was just overthinking it. Maybe it really was just a work thing. Maybe I was reading too much into his behavior. Dad seemed more relaxed now, laughing as we sifted through old DVDs, debating which movie to watch. "Remember this one?" he asked, holding up a faded case. "We watched this every Friday night when you were a kid." I smiled, the memory washing over me like a warm wave. "Yeah, you always fell asleep halfway through." I was resting my eyes, he corrected, grinning. For a moment, everything felt normal again, like the tension from earlier had never existed. But as we settled onto the couch, something shifted. It was subtle, just a glance that lingered a bit too long, a silence that stretched longer than it should. I told myself it was nothing, but the feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. The movie played in the background, but I wasn't really watching. My mind kept drifting back to that phone call, to the look on Dad's face when he thought I wasn't looking. What was he hiding, and why did it feel like it had something to do with me? At one point, I reached for the popcorn, and our hands brushed. It was such a small thing, but my heart skipped in a way I couldn't explain. I laughed it off, but I could feel his eyes on me, his gaze heavier than usual, like it was pressing into me. "You're quiet today," he said, breaking the silence. "Just tired," I lied, offering a half-hearted smile. "Long week." He nodded, but the way he looked at me told me he wasn't buying it. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, but then he just smiled softly, almost wistfully, and turned back to the screen. By the time the movie ended, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the room. I stood a stretch, ready to call it a night, but he stopped me with a hand on my arm. "Wait," he said, his voice quieter now. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." My heart raced. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly against my skin. I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "For everything. You've grown into someone amazing." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Thanks," I whispered finally. He smiled, letting his hand drop back to his side. "I just thought you should know." The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken emotions, before he cleared his throat and stepped back. "Anyway," he said, his tone shifting to something lighter, "I should probably start dinner." I nodded, watching him walk away, his movements slow and deliberate. Something was definitely going on, but I had no idea what. The next morning, the house felt unusually quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you get after a long, exhausting week. No, this was different. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see my dad sitting at the table with his usual mug of coffee, but the chair was empty, the mug untouched. I frowned, scanning the room. "Dad?" I called, my voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Maybe he'd gone for a walk or run an errand. It wasn't unusual for him to leave early, but today something felt off. Shaking off the unease, I opened the fridge and grabbed the milk, trying to carry on like everything was fine. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper, neatly folded, sitting on the counter. My name was scrawled across the front. My stomach dropped. The way my name was written, quick, slanted, almost rushed, made my hands tremble as I unfolded the note. I braced myself for whatever it might say. The words were brief but jarring. "Don't ask questions. Let it go. I'll explain later." My heart sank. What was going on? My dad had never kept secrets from me before, at least not like this. We'd always been close, maybe closer than most families. But now there was this distance between us, this secrecy. It felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, and I had no idea how to stop it. I spent most of the morning trying to distract myself, cleaning, reading, even aimlessly scrolling through my phone. But no matter what I did, the note stayed on my mind, an unanswered question I couldn't shake. By afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed my keys and drove over to my best friend's house. If anyone could help me make sense of all this, it was her. She always knew how to help me see things clearly when my mind felt like a jumbled mess. When I got there, she was already waiting on the porch with a mug of coffee in hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Not a ghost," I muttered, plopping down beside her. "But something's definitely off." I handed her the note, watching as her eyes scanned the words. She frowned, pressing her lips into a thin line. "This is weird," she said. "Are you sure it's from your dad?" "Who else would it be?" I replied, exasperated. "He was acting strange yesterday, too. There was this phone call. He seemed so tense. And now this." I gestured to the note like it was some kind of evidence. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze thoughtful as she considered the situation. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe it's work. You know how stressful things can get for him sometimes," she said, glancing at me. I shook my head. "It's not just work. It's more than that. I can feel it." "Well," she leaned back in her chair, "you've got two choices. Wait for him to explain, or start digging." I stared at her, caught off guard. "Digging." She shrugged casually. "I'm not saying you should break into his email or anything, but if you're curious, you have every right to know if this affects you. Don't you?" Her words echoed in my mind long after I left her house. Was I crossing a line by looking deeper? Or was I just being protective of myself? My dad had always been honest with me, at least I thought he had. If he was hiding something now, didn't I owe it to him to give him the time to explain? But what if that explanation never came? By the time I got home, the house was still quiet, empty. The unease from earlier was back, heavier now, settling in my chest like a weight. I wandered into the living room, half expecting to find another note, another cryptic message, but there was nothing. Just silence. I sank down onto the couch, my mind racing. I couldn't sit around and do nothing. I needed something, Anything that would help me understand what was going on. That's when I remembered the small box in the hallway closet. It was one of the few places my dad kept locked, one he'd always told me to leave alone. I hesitated. Was this crossing a line? Would he be furious if he found out? Probably. But my curiosity got the best of me. If there were answers, maybe they were in that box. The lock came off easily enough. With a soft click, it opened, and I held my breath as I lifted the lid. Inside were papers, mostly letters, and a few old photos. At first glance, they didn't seem significant, but as I flipped through them, my stomach churned. The letters were addressed to my dad, but the handwriting wasn't his. The photos were even stranger. There was one of a younger version of my dad with a woman I didn't recognize, smiling, her arm draped casually around his shoulders. But it was the next photo that stopped my heart cold, a baby in the woman's arms, with my dad standing proudly beside her. Who were they? The sound of the front door opening made me jump. I barely had time to shove the box back into the closet before my dad walked in. His face was unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice too casual. "You've been out. Just want to see a friend," I replied, forcing a smile, hoping he couldn't see the panic in my eyes. "How about you?" I asked, trying to sound normal. "Busy day," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "Yeah, you could say that." There was a long pause, and the silence between us stretched like a rubber band on the verge of snapping. I wanted to ask him about the note, the photos, the woman, the baby, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I managed, "Dinner?" He blinked, clearly caught off guard by the shift in topic. "Sure. Let me grab a shower first." As he disappeared down the hall, I leaned against the counter, my thoughts spinning. There were so many questions, so many things I needed to know. But one thought rose above all the others, clear and undeniable. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stay hidden for much longer. The next morning started much like the one before, quiet. Too quiet. My dad had already left the house by the time I woke up, leaving only the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. For a moment, I wondered if he'd left another note. Maybe some explanation for the first one. But when I checked the counter, it was empty. No folded paper, no cryptic message. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or disappointed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, the events of the past few days swirling in my head. The note, the phone call, the photos I'd found in the box, they didn't add up. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it all. Who was the woman in the picture? Who was the baby? Why had my dad hidden all of this away, locked up like some shameful secret? And the most terrifying question of all, what did it all have to do with me? By the time my dad came home that evening, I was ready for answers. I'd spent the whole day working up the courage to confront him, rehearsing what I would say and how. I wasn't sure how he would react. Angry, defensive, maybe even dismissive, but I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Not anymore. He walked in just after 6, looking tired but calm, like everything was normal. "Hey," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "What's for dinner?" I stared at him, my chest tight. "We need to talk." He froze, his hand halfway to the fridge. "About what?" "About the note," I said, standing up. "And the photos. And whatever it is you're not telling me." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine, as though he was weighing how much I already knew. Finally, he sighed, closed the fridge door, and leaned against the counter. "I was hoping we wouldn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Do what?" I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "You're keeping secrets. You owe me the truth, Dad." He winced as though the word truth had physically hurt him. "It's not that simple," he said, looking away. "There are things you don't understand. Things I've been trying to protect you from." "Protect me?" I laughed bitterly. "From what? From the woman in those pictures? From the baby? Who are they?" He looked away again, his jaw clenched tight. For what felt like forever, he didn't speak, and I thought he might just walk away. But then, he said something that left me breathless. "She was someone I knew a long time ago," he said. "Before you were born." "And the baby?" I pressed, my voice trembling. There was a flicker in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. He was my son. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't breathe.
Couldn't think.
Your son? I whispered. You had another child? Yes, he said, his voice heavy. But it's not what you think, he said quietly. He's not around anymore. I froze, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What happened to him? Even though part of me didn't want to know, I had to ask. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated, he said finally. There was an accident, a car crash. He didn't make it. I stared at him, my mind spinning. My dad had another family, another child, and that child was gone. And I'd never known. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice shaking. Why did you hide this from me? Because it wasn't your burden to carry, he said softly. It's my past, not yours. But it is my burden, I shot back, the words coming out sharper than I intended. You can't just pretend it didn't happen. You can't lock it away and hope it stays there. I wasn't pretending, he said, his voice rising. I was trying to move on.
For your sake.
For your mother's sake. I didn't want to drag you into something that had nothing to do with you. Nothing to do with me? I repeated, my anger bubbling over. I'm your daughter, Dad. If it matters to you, it matters to me. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the guilt in his eyes. I didn't know how to tell you, he admitted, his voice breaking. I thought it would be easier to keep it to myself. But I see now that I was wrong. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging between us. I didn't know what to say. How could I? My dad had always been my rock, my safe place. And now he felt like a stranger. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my coat. Wait, he said quickly, stepping forward. Don't go like this. Let's talk about it. Talk about what? I snapped, the bitterness in my voice impossible to hide. The fact that you lied to me? The fact that you kept this whole part of your life a secret. I can't do this right now, Dad. He didn't try to stop me as I walked out. I don't know if he knew I needed space or if he was just too exhausted to fight anymore. Either way, I didn't look back. The cold air slapped my face, but it did little to clear my thoughts. I wandered aimlessly, my mind trapped in the images of the photos. The woman, the baby, the love my dad had for them before they were gone. Locked away in the past like a painful secret. But it wasn't just his past anymore. It was mine too. By the time I got home, the lights in the house were off. My dad was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes red-rimmed, his face tired. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. For everything. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let it go. But the other part, the part that felt betrayed, couldn't. Good night, I said quietly, turning toward my room. I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like the start of something much harder. Morning light filtered through the blinds, casting pale streaks across the room, but it did little to brighten the heavy mood. I woke up feeling as if I'd run a marathon in my sleep. Exhausted, drained, unsure of what to do next. My dad's confession had left me spinning, and despite all the questions I still had, I wasn't sure I was ready to face him again. I spent the day holed up in my room, pretending to do schoolwork, but my mind kept returning to the photos, the baby, and the grief in my dad's eyes when he spoke of losing his son. The idea of him carrying that grief alone for so long made my chest ache, but the anger still simmered. He'd hidden so much from me. Things I had a right to know. How could I forgive that? It wasn't until late afternoon that I ventured out. I found him in the living room, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets. The TV was off, and the room was silent except for the creak of the floorboards as I entered. He didn't turn around at first, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed to fold in on himself. You've been standing there for a while, I said softly. Everything okay? He glanced back at me, his expression unreadable. Just thinking. I hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between us. Finally, I said, you know, you don't have to stand out here by yourself. If you're bored or, I don't know, lonely, you can come hang out with me. A small smile flickered across his face. Faint but genuine. You wouldn't mind? I shrugged, trying to sound casual even though my heart was pounding. Of course not. It's better than you standing here looking like a sad painting. His smile widened a little, and he nodded. All right, I'll keep that in mind. The rest of the evening passed in uneasy silence. We ate dinner together, polite, stilted conversation, as though we were both walking on eggshells. Afterward, he retreated to the living room again, and I went back to my room. I closed the door behind me with a sigh, trying to focus on my book, but the words blurred together, my thoughts too loud to ignore. Then, the sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my trance. The door creaked open, and I looked up to see my dad standing there, hesitant. You said I could come in if I got bored, he said, his voice light but uncertain. I smiled and waved him in. I did. He stepped inside, looking around like it was his first time in the room. I don't think I've been in here since you redecorated. Probably not, I said, closing my book and setting it aside. It's not much, but it's mine. He nodded and sat in the chair by the desk. We just sat there, the silence between us starting to ease. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My dad's presence in my room had been oddly comforting, a reminder of the bond we used to share before everything became so complicated. But it also brought back memories of when I was a kid, when my mom worked late and it was just the two of us at home. I remembered how he'd try to keep me entertained, building forts in the living room, teaching me card games, letting me stay up late to watch movies. Those had been some of my favorite times with him. Now they felt like a distant dream. Things were different. We were different. The next morning, I found another note on the counter. But this one was different. It wasn't cryptic or vague like the first message. This one was straightforward. We need to talk. Meet me in the living room. My stomach clenched as I picked up the note, the words feeling heavy in my hand. I wasn't sure I was ready for another conversation, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Taking a deep breath, I headed to the living room where he was already waiting. He looked up when I entered. His face was serious. Thanks for coming, he said. I know things have been tense between us, but I need to clear the air. I nodded and sat down across from him. Okay, let's talk. He hesitated for a moment, running his hand through his hair. I know I've made mistakes, he started. I've been hiding things from you, pushing you away. It wasn't fair, he continued. And I'm sorry. But I need you to understand. I did what I thought was best for our family. Best for who? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. For you? Or for me? He flinched but didn't look away. For both of us. I didn't want you to carry the weight of my past. I wanted you to have a clean slate, a chance to be happy without my baggage. But you didn't give me a choice, I said, my chest tightening. You made the decision for me. You lied to me. I know, he said quietly, his voice breaking. And I hate myself for it. But I can't change what's already happened. All I can do now is try to make things right. The room fell into silence. His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I didn't just see him as my dad. I saw him as a person, flawed, struggling, deeply human. The hurt didn't go away, but it softened a little. I don't know if I can forgive you, I finally said. Not yet. He nodded, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. That's fair. Just don't shut me out completely, okay? I didn't answer, but the look on his face told me he understood. This wasn't the end of our conversation, but it felt like a step in the right direction. As I walked back to my room that night, I was overwhelmed by a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. The days that followed felt like we were stuck in some kind of limbo. My dad and I weren't avoiding each other anymore, but things still didn't feel normal. Conversations were awkward, with long pauses where the unspoken tension lingered. I wanted to believe we were making progress, but each time I looked at him, I couldn't help but notice how much had changed. One evening, after dinner, I retreated to my room, hoping music would drown out my thoughts. I barely got my headphones on when there was a knock at the door. Before I could respond, my dad stepped inside, looking both unsure and determined. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I know you're probably tired of me barging in, but I've been thinking about what you said the other day." I paused the music and turned to face him. And you were right," he admitted. "I shouldn't have made those decisions for you. I should have trusted you enough to tell you the truth." His words caught me off guard. For so long, I had been waiting for him to acknowledge the ways he'd hurt me. And now that he had, I didn't know how to respond. "Thanks," I said finally. "That means a lot." He nodded, lingering in the doorway. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," I said, motioning to the chair by my desk. He sat down, glancing around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "You've got a nice setup here," he said, his tone light but sincere. "Makes me feel old, just looking at all this tech." I chuckled. "You're not that old. Tell that to my knees," he joked. And for a brief moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. But then his face grew serious again. "There's something I need to tell you." I braced myself, unsure of what was coming.
Okay, I'm listening.
He hesitated, searching for the right words. "When I lost my first son, it broke me," he said softly. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to move on. But then you came along. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a purpose again." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. A mix of pain and gratitude swirled in my chest. "I didn't know I meant that much to you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea," he replied, his gaze steady. "That's why I kept it all locked away. I didn't want my past to overshadow your future." I nodded, struggling to find the right response. "I get that now," I said at last. "But it still hurts." "I know," he said. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." After he left, I sat there for a while, replaying our conversation in my mind. It wasn't perfect. It didn't take away the betrayal or the pain, but it felt like a step forward. Maybe we couldn't go back to how things were, but maybe we didn't need to. Maybe we could build something new. The next day, I found an unexpected surprise. While cleaning out the garage, I stumbled upon a small box, hidden behind a stack of old books. It wasn't locked, but the way it was tucked away made me hesitate before opening it. Inside, I found more photos, but these were different. They weren't of my dad's first family. They were of us, me as a baby, taking my first steps, my dad holding my tiny hands. There was a photo of me on my first day of school, grinning nervously at the camera, with my dad standing proudly beside me. At the bottom of the box, there was a notebook. Flipping through it, I realized it was his journal, a record of his thoughts and feelings from the years after the death of his first son. Reading it felt like stepping into his mind, seeing the world through his eyes. He wrote about his grief, his guilt, his fear of losing everything again. But he also wrote about me, how I gave him hope, how I made him want to keep going. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. I had spent so much time being angry at him for what he'd kept from me. But now I saw the other side. The love, the pain, the sacrifices he made to protect me. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge, but I knew one thing for sure. I needed to talk to him. That evening, I found him in the living room watching TV. He looked up when I walked in, his expression cautious. "What's up?" "I found your journal," I said, holding it up. His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't get angry. "I see," he said. "I read it," I admitted, sitting down beside him. "I hope that's okay." He nodded slowly. "It's fine. I figured you'd find it eventually. I didn't realize how much you were carrying," I said. "I knew it wasn't easy for you, but reading your words, it made me see things differently." He didn't say anything at first, just nodded again. Then, quietly, he said, "It wasn't easy, but I'd do it all again if it meant keeping you safe." We sat there in silence for a while, the journal resting between us. The tension felt like it was lifting, replaced by something quieter, something softer. It wasn't perfect, but maybe it didn't have to be. It might never be perfect, but for now, it was enough. As I made my way back to my room that night, something clicked. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about pretending the hurt never happened or wiping the slate clean. It was about understanding the whole picture and choosing to move forward, despite everything. Maybe we still had a long road ahead, but at least we were finally moving in the right direction. The next morning, the house felt lighter, even though the memories of the past week still lingered, like shadows hiding in the corners. I woke up earlier than usual, the sunlight filtering through my curtains, gently pulling me awake for the first time in days. There was a strange sense of peace, a quiet calm after the storm. It wasn't the end of our journey, but it felt like we were on the right path at last. Downstairs, I found my dad sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his expression soft but weary. "Morning," he said, offering a faint smile. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of tea and sitting down across from him. We sat there for a moment, the silence between us feeling almost comfortable, like something we were learning to live with. I thought about the journal, the photos, and everything we'd said over the past few days. Without thinking too much about it, I spoke. "Tell me about him." My dad blinked, surprised. "About who?" "Your son," I said quietly. "I want to know who he was." For a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes shifted to the window, and I saw his fingers tighten around the mug. But then he took a deep breath and started. "He was amazing," he said, his voice steady, though it wavered with emotion. "Smart, curious. Always asking questions. He loved cars. Used to make me take him to every auto show we could find. And his laugh, that laugh. It could light up a room." I listened, my chest tightening as he shared stories I'd never heard before. He talked about the way his son would follow him around the house, always wanting to help, always wanting to be part of whatever he was doing. He told me about the small things, the way his son would hum to himself when he was concentrating, the way he'd fall asleep holding his favorite toy car. And then, just like that, he was gone. My dad's voice broke as he said the words. Just like that. One minute he was there and the next he wasn't. I reached across the table, placing my hand gently over his. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice thick. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening, for letting me share this with you." Later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, he handed me something, a small, worn book with a leather cover. "This was his," he said. "He used to write in it all the time. Little stories, drawings, things he wanted to remember." I opened the book carefully, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was small and uneven, the drawings simple but full of life. It was like peeking into a world I'd never known, a glimpse of the boy who had meant so much to my dad. "I want you to have it," my dad said, his voice soft but sure. "You're a part of him, too, even if you never met him." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him, at the man who had carried so much pain but still found the strength to love, protect, and move forward. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll take good care of it." As the evening wore on, we sat together, flipping through the book, sharing stories and memories for the first time in a long while. It felt like we were truly connecting, not just as father and daughter, but as two people who had weathered the same storm and were finding a way to heal together. Before I headed to bed, he stopped me in the hallway. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that no matter what happens, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." I smiled, feeling a swell of love and gratitude. "You're not so bad yourself," I teased him gently. As I closed my bedroom door behind me, clutching the little leather book to my chest, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. Hope that we could heal, that we could move forward, that we could carry the weight of the past together.